My sister-in-law looked me dead in the eyes and said, "This dinner is for people who actually belong in this family." I didn't say anything. I just picked up my son's coat from the chair, took his hand, and walked out. That was the night before Thanksgiving. I want to be clear about something before I go any further. I'm not someone who cries easily. I'm a nurse. I work 12-hour shifts in a cardiac unit, and I have held the hands of people taking their last breath. And I have walked to my car after and driven home without falling apart because I had a 7-year-old who needed dinner and a bath and someone to check under his bed for monsters. I don't fall apart easily. But that night, sitting in my car in my brother-in-law's driveway while my son asked me why we were leaving so early, I had to grip the steering wheel for a solid 2 minutes before I could trust my voice enough to answer him. "We're going to have our own dinner, buddy," I told him. "Just the two of us. We'll make it special." He looked at me with those big brown eyes and said, "Can we have pie for breakfast tomorrow?" I laughed. And then I cried. And then I laughed again. His name is Owen. He's 7 years old and he has his father's ears and my stubbornness, and he is, without question, the best thing that has ever happened to me. His father, my husband Brandon, passed away 3 years ago from a brain aneurysm. He was 31. He went to work on a Tuesday morning, and by Thursday he was gone. There's no way to explain what that does to a person. There's no timeline for it, no clean ending. You just learn to carry it differently as time goes on. Brandon's family was never warm to me, even when he was alive. His mother, Eleanor, treated me like a temporary inconvenience that her son had unfortunately gotten attached to. His brother Garrett was fine in a surface-level way. Polite at Christmas, distant at Easter, the kind of person who shakes your hand instead of hugging you even after 10 years. But Garrett's wife Simone was a different story entirely. Simone is beautiful, strategic, and deeply committed to being the center of every room she walks into. She married into the family 2 years before I did, which meant she had 2 years of uncontested territory before I arrived. When Brandon brought me home for the first time, I watched Simone's face do something that I can only describe as a rapid recalculation. She smiled at me, complimented my earrings, and spent the rest of the evening subtly repositioning herself next to Eleanor in every conversation. For years I told myself I was imagining it. Brandon would laugh when I brought it up. "Simone's just like that," he'd say. "She grew up competing for attention. Don't take it personally." I tried not to. I focused on my marriage, my career, my son. I let a lot of things go. After Brandon died, I couldn't let things go as easily anymore. The patience I'd had when he was alive, that buffer of "this isn't worth the fight," was gone. I was a widow at 29 with a 4-year-old, and I did not have the bandwidth to manage anyone else's ego on top of everything else. Eleanor made it clear early on that she expected to be the primary person in Owen's life. She called constantly, showed up without notice, and once told me, with what I can only describe as genuine conviction, that Owen would be better off spending more time at her house because she had a backyard in a neighborhood with good schools. As if I didn't. As if I hadn't spent every spare dollar and every ounce of energy making sure my son had a stable, loving home. I set a gentle boundary. I told her I was happy for Owen to spend time with her, but I needed notice before visits, and I needed to be the one making decisions about his schooling and daily life. She received this the way most people receive criticism they weren't expecting, with a long, wounded silence and then a pivot to martyrdom. "I just want to be part of my grandson's life," she said. "You are part of his life," I said. "I'm just asking for basic communication." She hung up and called Garrett, and from that point forward, I was the problem. For the next 2 years, family events became a kind of slow-burn hostility wrapped in table settings and holiday decorations. I was invited, technically, but made to feel like my presence was a burden. Simone would organize the seating so that I was at the end of the table, furthest from the people I actually knew. Garrett would ask Owen questions in that loud, performative way that adults do when they want to demonstrate affection without actually making room for a child. Eleanor would sigh a lot, just sighing, at nothing in particular, into her wine glass. I kept showing up because Owen loved his cousins. Garrett and Simone had 2 kids, a girl named Addison and a boy named Cole, and Owen adored them the way only children can adore other children, Ken Abduli unconditionally, without any awareness of the adult drama happening 3 feet above their heads. So I kept going. I kept smiling. I kept bringing the green bean casserole that nobody touched, and leaving early enough to avoid the part of the evening where Eleanor had enough wine to say things she couldn't technically be held accountable for in the morning. Then came the summer that Brandon's grandparents, his mother's parents, Grandpa Ray and Grandma June, came back into the picture. I say came back because they'd been largely absent for years. They lived about 4 hours away in a small town outside of Knoxville, and they were in their mid-80s and travel had become difficult. I had met them 3 or 4 times when Brandon was alive, and I remembered them as genuinely warm people. The kind of grandparents who remembered what you said last time and asked about it next time, who listened when you talked without waiting for their turn to speak. Brandon had been close to them as a child. He talked about summers at their house the way people talk about places that shaped them. After Brandon died, I sent them a handwritten card. I didn't know what to say, so I just wrote about him. One specific memory, a story he'd told me about fishing with his grandfather when he was 8, and catching something too small to keep and crying about it anyway, and how his grandfather had said, "That just means he'll be back." I don't know why I chose that story. It just felt right. 3 weeks later, I got a card back from Grandma June. It was 2 pages, front and back, in the most careful handwriting I'd ever seen. She told me about Brandon as a little boy. She said she was grateful I'd written. She said she hoped we could stay in touch. We did. Phone calls mostly, every few weeks. She would ask about Owen, and I would tell her something funny he'd said or done, and she would laugh. That laugh sounds like it comes from a very deep, very genuine place. I looked forward to those calls more than I could have predicted. Grandpa Ray would sometimes get on the line near the end and say a few words. He was a man of very few words. But the ones he said always landed with a kind of quiet weight that I thought about afterward. Eleanor did not know about these calls. I don't know how I knew to keep them private. I just did. In October, Grandpa Ray and Grandma June told me they were coming to Nashville for a family gathering, a Thanksgiving that Eleanor was hosting. They asked if I was going to be there. I said I thought so. They said they were looking forward to seeing Owen. I told Eleanor at the beginning of November that Ray and June had mentioned the visit, and I asked if I could confirm with them that Owen and I were included. Eleanor's response was careful in a way that told me it had been rehearsed. She said the dinner was immediate family, and she wasn't sure it was the right environment for someone who was, and I'm quoting directly here, technically no longer part of the family. I want to sit with that phrase for a second. Technically no longer part of the family. I was the mother of her grandson. I had been married to her son for 6 years. I had been at her side in that hospital when Brandon died, holding her hand in the waiting room before I'd even processed what was happening to me. Because she needed someone and I was there. Technically no longer part of the family. I didn't argue. I said, okay, I understand. And I got off the phone. And then I called Grandma June and told her what had happened. Not to cause trouble. Because she had asked if I was coming, and she deserved an honest answer. There was a long pause. Then she said, "Let me talk to Ray." I thought that was the end of it. I made other plans. I told Owen that we were going to have a special Thanksgiving of our own, and I meant it. We made the whole thing together. He helped me measure the flour for the rolls, and we burned the first batch a little, and he said very seriously, "I think we should still eat them," and so we did. We were in the middle of our meal when the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone. I almost didn't answer it because I was in an apron and my hair was a disaster and I had flour somewhere on my face. But Owen slid off his chair and ran for the door before I could stop him, the way 7-year-olds do when a doorbell rings, as if it might be literally anything wonderful. He opened the door and then turned around with his eyes enormous and yelled, "Mom, it's the great-grandparents." Ray and June were standing on my porch with a pecan pie and a casserole dish and the kind of smiles that don't have any performance in them. I stood there in my apron and I genuinely could not speak for a moment. "We figured you'd have food," June said, "but we brought some anyway. Because that's what you do." Ray said nothing. He just held out the casserole dish and nodded once in a way that communicated about 40 things simultaneously. I stepped back and let them in. We sat at that table for almost 3 hours. Owen climbed into Ray's lap approximately 12 minutes after they arrived and stayed there, on and off, for the rest of the evening, telling him things with the total seriousness that children reserve for people they instinctively trust. Ray listened to every word. June and I talked about everything: her childhood in East Tennessee, what Owen was like at school, what I was working toward at the hospital, Brandon. We talked about Brandon. I didn't cry, and neither did she, but it was close more than once, and somehow that felt right too. At some point near the end of the night, Ray said, unprompted, in the middle of a quiet moment, "Brandon would be real proud of you." 4 words. Just 4 words. And I had to excuse myself to the kitchen for a minute. I didn't know then what Ray and June had decided. I didn't know that they had left Eleanor's Thanksgiving dinner early, barely 2 hours in, and driven 4 hours to my house unannounced. I didn't know what they'd said to Eleanor before they left, or whether anything had been said at all. I only knew that they were there, at my table, on a day when I had been made to feel like I didn't count. I found out the rest of it in January. Eleanor called me, which was unusual. Our communication had become almost entirely indirect by then, filtered through Garrett or conveyed via Owen's school calendar. When I saw her name on my screen, I almost let it go to voicemail. I picked up on the last ring. She told me that Ray and June had informed the family they were revising their estate plans. They had spoken with their attorney in December. The revisions included a direct bequest to Owen, a trust specifically set up in his name, to be administered for his education and future needs, managed by a trustee who was not Eleanor. They had also decided to transfer their property, a piece of land outside Knoxville that had been in the family for 3 generations, to Owen directly, as a gift, with me named as the managing guardian until he turned 25. This was not a will that would take effect after their deaths. Ray and June, with the full guidance of their attorney, had structured it as a living transfer. The land was already Owen's, recorded and filed. The trust was already funded. It was done. It was real. It was not contingent on anything. Eleanor's voice was extremely controlled during this phone call, the kind of control that takes visible effort. She told me she felt it was important that I understand the situation. I said I appreciated her calling. Then she said, "I hope you know that what you did, keeping those phone calls from the family, was manipulative." I took a breath. "Eleanor," I said, "Grandma June called me because I wrote her a letter when Brandon died. That's the whole story. I didn't ask her for anything. I didn't tell her what to do with her estate. I sent her a card about her grandson, and she wrote back, and we kept talking because we liked talking to each other. That's it." She didn't respond to that directly. She said something about family dynamics and going forward, and I said I hoped we could find a way to make things work for Owen's sake, and then we got off the phone. I sat for a long time after that. I want to be careful here about what I'm saying, because I think it matters. I didn't become close with Ray and June because I wanted something from them. I became close with them because they are genuinely good people, and because talking to them made me feel less alone during the hardest years of my life, and because they loved Brandon, and they loved Owen, and those 2 things alone were enough. Whatever they decided to do with their estate is theirs to decide. It always was. But I am not going to pretend that the timing didn't mean something, that it didn't say something about what they had seen, over all those years of watching, about who in this family had actually shown up. The following spring, Grandma June asked if Owen and I would consider driving up to Knoxville for a long weekend. She said the dogwoods would be blooming and Ray wanted to take Owen fishing. I said yes immediately. We stayed 4 days. Owen caught his first real fish on the second afternoon, a small bass that he held up like a trophy while Ray took his picture, and then he asked very seriously if they had to release it. Ray looked at it, looked at Owen, and said, "What do you think?" Owen thought about it for a long moment. "I think he wants to go home," he said. They put it back. On the drive home, Owen fell asleep in the back seat about 40 minutes in, the way children do after days spent entirely outdoors, completely, immediately, like a light switch. I drove through the mountains with the windows cracked and the radio low, and I thought about Brandon saying that his grandfather had told him the fish would come back. I thought about that card June had sent me 3 years ago, 2 pages, front and back, in careful handwriting. I thought about my son's face when Ray had taken his picture. I didn't have a neat way to wrap up what I was feeling. I still don't. Life doesn't usually hand you that. What I know is this. I spent years shrinking myself to fit into spaces where I wasn't wanted, telling myself it was for Owen's sake, telling myself that stability mattered more than dignity. And then two people in their mid-80s drove 4 hours on Thanksgiving to sit at my table with a casserole dish, and nothing has felt quite the same since. My brother-in-law still barely speaks to me. Eleanor still sends passive-aggressive text on holidays that I respond to with three-word answers and mild emojis. Simone posted a family photo last Christmas that did not include Owen, which I saw and then put my phone down and went to make hot chocolate. But Owen has started calling Ray every Sunday night. Just to talk. Ray is a man of very few words, and Owen is a 7-year-old who has very many, and somehow it works out perfectly. And when I picked Owen up from school last week, he ran to the car with a drawing he'd made in art class. It was a picture of 4 people standing next to a river. 2 of them are very small, and 2 of them are very tall and slightly wobbly in the way that only kids, drawing old people, can capture. At the bottom, in the careful, oversized letters of a child still learning to write, it said, "My family." I put it on the refrigerator. It's still there. I've thought a lot about why things turned out the way they did. Not in a the universe rewarded me kind of way, because I don't think life works like a vending machine where you put in good behavior and get justice out. It's messier than that. But I do think there's something real in the idea that how you treat people, consistently over time when nothing is on the line, ends up mattering in ways you can't always predict. I didn't write to June because I wanted something. I wrote because she had just lost her grandson and I had just lost my husband, and it seemed like the least human thing in the world to let that pass in silence. That's it. That's the whole calculation, if you can even call it that. And what came back from that? The phone calls, the visits, and Sunday night conversations with Ray. That drawing on my refrigerator. None of it was something I planned for or worked toward. It just grew the way things grew when they're watered honestly. Eleanor called what I did manipulative. I've sat with that word a lot. I understand why she reached for it. Because the alternative explanation, that her own parents chose to show up at my door instead of staying at her table, is harder to absorb. But choosing manipulation as the explanation means she never has to ask the harder question, which is, what did they see over all those years that made them want to be here instead of there? I'm not asking that question to be cruel. I genuinely think it's the only question that matters. There's something I want to say about raising Owen in the middle of all of this. I made a lot of decisions I wasn't sure about. Setting boundaries with Eleanor felt uncomfortable every single time, even when I knew they were right. Keeping those phone calls with June and Ray private felt like a small act of self-preservation that I second-guessed more than once. Showing up to family dinners where I wasn't wanted. Doing it anyway, for years, because my son loved his cousins. Cost something. I'm not going to pretend it didn't. But I think what I was actually doing, without always knowing it, was showing Owen what it looks like to keep your integrity in situations where it would be easier not to. To be kind without being a doormat. To hold a boundary without holding a grudge. To let a 7-year-old catch a small fish and put it back because he decided it wanted to go home. None of that is a lesson I sat him down and taught. It's just what I tried to live imperfectly in front of him every day. Ray and June saw something in me that the rest of that family had decided not to look for. And what they saw wasn't anything extraordinary. It was just consistency. Showing up. Meaning what I said. That's not heroic. It's just the baseline of being a decent person. But apparently it's rarer than I thought, because when they found it, they held on. Owen is going to grow up knowing that his family is the people who drove 4 hours with a casserole dish, the people who listened to every word he said, the people who let him decide about the fish. That's not a small thing. That's everything.